Let's talk about intuitive training. Firstly, what is it? Intuitive training is about leveraging natural instincts, experience, and real-time adaptability to enhance the skill development of your students. A definition I did come across is that it's a teaching approach that combines structured methods with instinctive responses to learner needs, fostering faster mastery and engagement. Research shows intuitive decision-making improves the experience, and expert trainers make 70% of their decisions subconsciously. So the takeaway here is that it's not some sort of winging it. It's informed, instinct-honed practice. Vocational learners need practical, hands-on, fast skill tuition. Intuition bridges the theory and real-world application. So 85% of Australian employers value that adaptability and problem-solving over rote knowledge. This is from a report from Skills Australia back in 2023. The hot tip here is to use intuition to spot when a learner is ready to move from guided practice to some sort of independent work. The takeaway here is that intuitive training aligns with the demand for agile, job-ready workers. Here's a few tips. Observe body language, energy levels, and verbal cues to adjust the pacing or content on the fly. This is about reading the room. So for an example, if your learners look confused, pause for a quick Q&A. If they're restless, switch to a hands-on task. An interesting fact here is that studies show trainers who adapt intuitively to group dynamics improve their learner retention by up to 30%. This is based on an article in Education Psychology Review back in 2020. So the takeaway for tip number 1 here is to trust your gut to pivot. It's often faster than overanalyzing. Tip number 2 is to simplify without dumbing down. This technique breaks complex skills into intuitive chunks. Focus on what feels natural to the learner first. For example, teaching welding, then start perhaps with the grip and stance of the torch before worrying too much about how it's going to be applied. It mirrors how pros actually naturally define and refine their craft. So intuition thrives on clarity, not overload. So the takeaway here is that less is more when it builds on confidence early. Tip 3, share real-world anecdotes, so yours or industry examples, to make abstract things more relatable. For example, I once had a learner who mastered panel beating after he'd been kneading dough. I mean, the same rhythm and feel, right? It's an interesting fact here that storytelling actually activates the mirror neurons in the brain, making learners 20% more likely to retain the information they've been told. This can be proven very simply in a class. When you tell a story, people remember the ups and downs, the valleys and the troughs of that particular story more than they remember, say, a list of dot points. So the takeaway is stories turn intuition into actual action. Tip number 4 is to let learners lead sometimes. This technique requires you to step back and let the learners experiment. So intuition grows through trial and error. So for example, in a carpentry class, let them figure out how the joints fit before correcting them. It builds problem-solving instincts, which are essential in a real job environment. The key point is that over-guidance kills intuition. Controlled freedom nurtures it. Just like when you're teaching a child, the more you tell them what to do, the less they are aware or feel like they can make choices that they can share with you as to where they think they need to go. So one of the takeaways is trust their gut as much as your own. The last tip here, tip number 5, is more like a technique rather than a tip. And this is the 3-second pause. After asking a question or demonstrating a skill, pause for 3 or more seconds and let your learners process things intuitively. It gives the brain time to connect the dots without explicit prompting. You don't have to tell them what to think. Your learners want to know where to go with this point that you're showing them or you're telling them. An interesting fact here is that pausing boosts learner participation by up to 40%. This was in an article in Teaching and Learning Journal back in 2019. So the takeaway here is that silence is your trainer's secret weapon. If people don't want to answer, then politely ask them to join in the conversation or what they think, or rephrase the question. There's a lot of ways to get people to then interact after your 3-second pause if everything goes quiet. So your turn. Have a think about these. There's no way of me gauging your response here. So I'd like you to just have a think about how you would apply these things or have applied them. So for instance, a time where your instincts actually saved a training session. Did you do something or recognize something within your learners or the environment that you then employed within the training session that really saved it? How do you balance that intuition with the curriculum or the session plan that you're working against? You don't want to go outside the session plan or outside the curriculum too much because you still need those learning points covered, but your intuition is going to guide you. And finally, what's the hardest task that you think to teach intuitively? And why do you think that is? Is it the more regulated things that you need to do? Let's say you're teaching something in medicine and you need to actually teach the steps to do before they can complete the task correctly. Or maybe it's something in the building industry where, again, they have to follow a certain number of steps. So not so intuitive. However, you'll be surprised when you do let the learners lead for a moment. They might just surprise you with their own instincts. So to summarize all of this, I've left you with 5 very, very simple tips. Firstly, read the room. Always be very invested in what your learners are giving you, whether it's body language, nonverbal cues, verbal cues, etc. Simplify without dumbing down. Clarify points. Chunk them into smaller things that allow people to absorb the information better. 3, stories trigger instinct. Anecdotes, examples, your own personal stories or stories from the greater sector really help people put their learning into context. Number 4 is to let learners lead. As I just mentioned, sometimes it's good to let that leash out, for want of a better term, to let your learners tell you what they think they understand and why they understand it a certain way. And you might find that that leads your session in a different way. I was going to say a completely different way, but just a different way that might make it more important and potent for those people attending. And the 5th one was a 3-second pause, which is more of a technique than a tip, just to allow your learners some time to absorb things before they respond to you. So there are a lot more tips and tricks along the way that I could share with you, but just for this particular session, that's all I want to share for now. I hope this has been useful. If it has, I'd love you to comment on it, and I'll see you in the next video.